Welcome to the very first episode of this podcast series that's titled A Journey Through the Past, Present, and Future of Mining. I am Priscilla Nelson, and joining me is Mónica Ospina. We're really excited to kick off this series where we explore the intersection of the mining industry, environmental stewardship, and community engagement. In today's episode, we're joined by two esteemed guests, Sigurdson and Luke Danielson, who bring a wealth of experience in the mining and resource sectors. We'll be diving into their early experiences in the industry, their personal journeys, and how resource management has evolved over the years.
This episode takes us back in the time to explore the beginnings of both Glenn's and Luke's careers, touching on the complex dynamics between mining, indigenous communities, and environmental challenges. From Glenn's early days growing up in a resource-based fishing community to Luke's family history in mining, we will uncover how these experiences shaped their understanding of the industry and the critical issues that have marked the industry's evolution over the last 70 years. It's going to be a fascinating conversation.
Luke, I'm delighted that we're finally coming together to give life to this vision that Priscilla and Mónica have had to host a series of podcasts, and I'm really pleased that they've asked you and I to do it because we share a long personal history, but more importantly, a professional history that linked us in different ways at different times to what one might say is the broad trajectory in which the mining industry has evolved over the last 60 years in its relationship with the communities, people, and environment in which it's operating. We have a unique vantage point because we're not insiders in the industry, but we're inside the world in which mining operates with all of the players and have an insight into that. So for me, it's quite an exciting time for us to begin, and I'm hoping that we can create some interest in people just knowing a bit more about who it is that they're going to be spending some time with. And that we'll also be able to give an anticipation of some of the big themes that we're going to be looking at. So maybe you can pick it up from there if you would, Luke. And I know I'm real pleased to get this going, and maybe you can pick it up and offer some of the themes we want to look at.
Sure. I really am really grateful for the opportunity to talk on this and reflect back on what's now over 40 years of work in this field. As you point out, the work has come in a lot of different ways. I was actually inside the fence at one point. I was a lawyer for mining companies. It's been a long time since then. I think we've been spectators, and because of the unique kind of work that both of us have done, we've had an opportunity to get to know people, the industry, many of its critics, government officials, environmental organizations, indigenous groups who are part of, if not the mining industry, they're part of the mining sector, right? They have some real stake in how this turns out. So let's dive into this and start talking about what some of those issues are.
I kind of like to start from the beginning. How did my life evolve into the place we are now? We're lucky enough that we're at a stage in our life when we can reflect back and say, how did all this happen, this serendipity that brings us to this set of conversations? Well, for me, it really started growing up in a fishing family, an Icelandic fishing family on Lake Winnipeg, which is a major inland lake, and it brought me into a world where we had to build a accommodation with the resources in the lake and the opportunity to make a livelihood while sustaining the fish production. And we had to, as Icelanders that had come into that country in 1875, learn to work in close proximity with native people. So my life was really grounded in kind of a resource-based economy that had to balance the interest of people and the resource and building a sustainable future. So that was the beginning, and much of that I've come to understand kind of shaped where my career would go. And I didn't realize it, but it was the invisible guiding hand that was moving me along. What about you, Luke? You
Well,
started in a different way in Colorado, and I'm in Lake Winnipeg.
for me, mining was really a fundamental part of the background of my youth, right? When I was 5 years old, my friends and I would go down and play on this big pile of sand that was just down the street, which turned out to be, years later, I understood, wastes from a mill where minerals had been processed and incidentally really highly elevated in radium, and ultimately was dealt with as a hazardous waste, right? But uh, and my family came to Colorado, to Leadville, back in the early days of the silver boom in Leadville, and I grew up seeing tailings piles, head frames, smokestacks of smelters. They were part of the landscape I grew up in. My family were not miners, but they were railroaders, and they hauled supplies into the mining camps. They hauled ore out of the mining camps, and basically, mining was the backbone of the economy of the world they lived in.
Well, when you talk about uh, roads and railroads, it makes me think of the fact that in my family, we had to fish on open water and on the ice. And when you fish on the ice, you have to run trains, tractor trains, originally dog and horse trains to move things. But one of the biggest contracts that we had was to bring all the supplies by tractor train on the open ice of Lake Winnipeg, all the way to Patricia Mines, which was a mine in northeastern Ontario, right between Manitoba and Ontario. And so much of the history of mining is a bit like the history of any resource. It's transportation to move products in and move products out. So it's interesting. You triggered a memory in my mind that whether you're moving with tractor trains on ice or railroads over mountainous terrain, the goal is the same. You can't think of mining in isolation or fishing in isolation with the whole fabric of interconnections, including roadways. And one of the biggest issues that came to rise as the North was developing in Canada was the challenges of managing the interface between remote Indigenous communities who hadn't been exposed to a lot of the kinds of modernization that was occurring around them, and suddenly these roads were opening them up prematurely in some ways before they were really ready to cope with some of the activities that went in. So thinking about roads and mines is an important one, including railroads, of course.
Yeah, and look, it's evident as I've grown up and learned more about the world I live in. One of the things that's evident is that the number one driver of displacement of the indigenous people here in Colorado, in the regions I call home, was mining, right? The desire of other people to come in, take advantage of mineral resources, and push the indigenous people out. And that's a theme that goes all the way through my work today. I just published a book about this in Latin America, but worldwide, there's nothing that has been more key in the displacement of indigenous peoples than the minerals industries.
There's no question. I'd say that although I don't have the comparative facts, dams have also played a very important role in displacement, because wherever there's been major hydro projects in the world, it inevitably has taken place in fairly virgin territory often. That's required pretty massive disruption of the land base and the natural flow of the waterways, with very direct impacts to the communities that live along those shorelines. So between dams and mining, all of which occur in relatively remote areas often, There's been a lot of impacts that are unseen to those of us in the South often.
The next thing I really became aware of, or maybe it was the first, was, when my family arrived in Colorado, we were only, we were right at the time that the indigenous people were being rounded up and put on reservations, right? So the indigenous people were actually being, the Ute people, the Arapaho people were being displaced at a time that my family was moving in. The other big source of conflict was we had some of the most turbulent, violent, and distressing labor conflicts in the history of the United States here in Colorado and in other mining camps from Butte to Bisbee, right? So one theme was the displacement of indigenous peoples. Another theme was a very, very hard time the industry had finding any way to build common cause with the workers who were making it all possible.
You know, it's such an important theme, displacement, because in a Canadian context where I was growing up, it was hydro developments that first started to what I will call brutalize the North. To those people, it was clean energy, unlimited energy, and it's very easy to turn a switch on down in Winnipeg. But if you're up in the land of the Cree, every time that switch is turned, it means that there's another inch or two of water that's flowing or been held back. And when hydro first moved in and started to conceive of one of the greatest hydroelectric development projects in the world, 40% the size of James Bay, it was a hydrologic playpen that they were looking at, because by a configuration of nature, all of the waters from the Rocky Mountains and up into the Northwest Territories all found their exit point in one river flowing up from Lake Winnipeg. So it was ripe for this kind of thing. So all of the Cree people who once had been the backbone of the fur trade economy and the Hudson Bay Company in Northern Canada became vulnerable to the dynamics that were going on. And that was really the introduction I had into the hard-hitting reality of what development was going to mean. Manitoba was very energetically pursuing dam construction, and in the 70s, having come to law school, and I'll go back to that in a minute, I became the lawyer for 12,000 Cree people affected by hydro development with my partner McCaffrey, and that was going to university many times over from 1973 to 1984, and it took me in many directions. But that kind of huge implication had the de facto impact of not actual displacement, but fundamentally defining and altering the way they were making their living. So it's a displacement of economic activity as opposed to just physical displacement.
We've learned early on a couple of other lessons about the minerals industry. One of them is that in general, it's not a very stable economic framework, right?
Right.
There are times when people are making so much money they can't believe it, and the money is flowing out of the ground, and enormous amounts of capital are being stored up. Then there are times when suddenly everybody's unemployed. That happened in Leadville. A lot of the people in Leadville didn't even have the money to get out of town when finally the silver economy collapsed there. But we've gone through, and in most of the mineral producing regions of the world, we've gone through the boom and bust cycle, which is
Right.
another set of challenges.
You know, it goes in both ways. The boom creates all kinds of instability, and the downturn creates all kinds of instability. So I guess the basic lesson through both of the careers that we'll evolve in and share in the next few conversations that we have is we are living in a dynamic of change, constant evolution of change in our careers that we've been in the middle of. And where there's change, there's tensions and conflicts. And that's much of where my life evolved. But it didn't really start understanding what that was all about when the big focus was on the economic
Chris,
development that was focused in the 60s. That was the period in which we were really starting to boom forward.
my family through the generations here has had different relationships with the mining industry. My great grandfather and his brothers were all railroad engineers who worked on railroads, whose business was almost entirely mining. My grandfather had, through that, he created the opportunity to go to medical school, and he wound up being the mine doctor at a big copper pit in southern New Mexico, where he saw another set of issues. These were poor Hispanic communities in a mine that had been operating since the 1790s. It was the first largely Hispanic labor union in the United States. And that's where my father was born, was actually in the copper pit at Santa Rita, New Mexico. So my family has had a number of different interactions with the mining industry as we move forward. And I'm sure, Glenn, you have some stories of your family and its interaction with natural resource industries.
Well, let me go back just like you have. The community out of which I emerged came to to Canada in 1875. It's a unique Canadian story. It was very early on in the settlement of the prairies. We were worried about American expansionism into the Canadian West. I guess with the talk of your president-elect these days, one wonders whether or not we're going back to those times. But in any event, they were bringing in settlers, and they brought these Icelanders, and they gave them a self-governing tract of land along the shores of Lake Winnipeg, and brought them in on the end of October. And within 3 weeks, there was 3 feet of snow, and they were basically out on the open fields around Lake Winnipeg. Not a happy beginning. And the indigenous people became pretty critical to them in those early period of time. They didn't know how to fish under ice, and they had to learn how to do that, et cetera, et cetera. There's just a whole dynamic that evolved. And when that treaty was signed it was almost a treaty. They were given a reserve. They had an agent. They were given this large tract of land in which they had the ability to self-control. And it was outside the province of Manitoba in Canada. That's the same year that Treaty Number 5 covering a large part of northern Canada was signed. So it's deeply planted, and fishing became the way that they built a society, an economy, and survived in that environment. So by the time the 60s came around, somebody like me, born in the '50s and late '40s, was really living in a time warp because not much had changed. So I've had the very good fortune of remembering my grandfather's dogs dying that he'd fished with, and then the small tractor he had. So I think one of the things that we're able to bring into this conversation, as you just reflected, is a deep sense of where we came from, what our backgrounds are, in kind of a visceral way. It's part of our life story. And I think that that's part of what comes out of the work we've done. I think both of us are very deeply grounded in fundamental influences and values about where we came from. And I wrote this memoir, Vikings on a Prairie Ocean, and as I wrote that, it was a deeply introspective period because I was really asking myself, what caused you to do these things? And I came to appreciate that those influences and values were creeping into my life continuously in ways that were quite surprising. And I think that's part of the life story that both of us share. You just shared it now with your story of your grandfather.
The other thing I'd say is as I move forward with my career, for various reasons, I wound up going to law school and becoming a lawyer, as you did. While I was in law school, the big environmental law boom occurred. And so everyone was excited about environmental law. We were going to protect the planet. We were going to, protect people's health. And I moved forward wanting more than anything else to be an environmental lawyer. And ultimately, I wound up as regional counsel for the National Wildlife Federation, an environmental group here in the U.S. And the first thing that I wound up doing pretty much was responding to citizen concerns about mining. Colorado was at that point in the tail end of yet another boom and bust cycle. We were in the downturn of the uranium cycle, and there were really a lot of very poorly managed and very environmentally unsound uranium facilities here in Colorado. And I was turned loose by the Federation to try to deal with some of these sites, everywhere from the Schwarzwälder mine outside of Golden, where Priscilla lives, to the Canyon City Cotter Corporation, to the Durango smelter, to or the Durango uranium mill, I should say. So I got deeply involved in all that, and I wound up basically dealing with the environmental impacts of mining. Became my career.
In the 60s in Manitoba, it was becoming a hotbed of development activity. The big hydro projects were starting to come into play. Inco, the International Nickel Company, had built this huge town site and property at Thompson, Manitoba in the 50s under a massive development agreement, a company town, one of those, so that historical whole period was still alive. Then we had a large pulp and paper mill being built. And so the development forces were converging into Manitoba in a pretty intense way. And at that time, the University of Manitoba sensed the importance of understanding the relationship of these kinds of developments that were essentially one industry type towns that were evolving, one industry platforms. And they developed something called the Center for Settlement Studies, whose role was to look at the kind of implications of one industry towns. And there was over, 25 different disciplines represented. And I became part of a group, and it ultimately led me to focus on looking at the role of Indigenous people in these communities. And that was the center of my work with a fellow called Paul Dupre. And we wrote 2 or 3 major publications in the period, one of which was called The Economic Status of the Canadian Indian, a Reexamination. And the other, interestingly, was a focus on Pine Point mines in northwestern, on the South Shore of Great Slave Lake. That was a Cominco property, lead zinc, so rich that they didn't need to concentrate the ore before it left, straight onto boxcars. 150 million had been given for infrastructure development by the government of Canada, and in return, they required a commitment from Inco and the United Steelworkers that they would engage Indigenous people in the area. And I was retained with Dupre to examine the success that Cominco had with the steelworkers in fulfilling that obligation. So sometimes people think this is something new, but even in the 60s, we were already starting to struggle with the implications, and the same with the hydro developments. What is the potential for local development to impact people in positive ways, not just negative ways? So these things took me into a world that I ultimately left because I didn't want to become a professor. I left one day up the hill in McGill. I decided I didn't want to be an academic, and I would ultimately go to law school. But I reflect back on those days in Manitoba, and we were very much talking about economic development. That was the focus of all of the academic training, not human development. It was economic development. When you meant development, that was it. And so that's where I started, in kind of managing the relationship between the economy and people and the environment.
What led me in your direction ultimately, I wound up representing a group of 14 environmental organizations that were upset about the development of a high altitude uranium mine here in Colorado called the Pitch Uranium Mine by Homestake Mining. The idea was to build a uranium mine and mill at over 10,000 feet altitude. We were deeply concerned about whether the mine could be reclaimed and what was going to happen to the uranium mill tailings at that altitude. And we wound up in a big legal conflict with this mining company. And at some point, it's a critical turning point in my career, we wound up having somebody say, why don't you try mediating this dispute? To the best of my knowledge, no one had ever mediated a dispute like that in Colorado or frankly anywhere in the US before. And the Ford Foundation had put up some funding to start something called the Institute for Environmental Mediation, which among other people involved were your colleague, Jerry Cormack. And somebody said, why don't you talk to these people and see if you could sit down and try to talk through this conflict. And we ultimately decided to try mediating. It was a very big internal conflict on my side. A lot of people felt that there's no basis on which they would ever want to talk to a uranium company or try to agree with a uranium company on anything. And there were people on the mining side who felt the same way. But ultimately, we did submit this to a mediation process. And to the amazement of everybody, we wound up with an agreement. And the very fact that it was possible to reach an agreement that everybody was willing to live with on something that controversial was, I think, a considerable breakthrough here.
When you mention the name, it draws out another theme that birds of a feather tend to flock together, I guess. When I was in my first year of law school, I got a call from my dad one day. I was in Toronto going to school at a place called Osgood Hall, and my dad said, Glenn, they've gone nuts in Ottawa. They've shut down Lake Winnipeg. They say there's mercury, that stuff in thermometers, that's found its way all the way from Dryden, Ontario, 300 miles away. And they found it in the fish in Lake Winnipeg, so they shut down the fishery. Well, apparently, the toxicologist in the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, upon some young graduate student discovering this, were in a complete tailspin. So they shut everything down. They shut the rivers down. They shut guiding. They even shut down Lake Winnipeg for 2.5 years till they got a handle on this mercury. Why I mention that, though, is because it figured largely in my life when I went to law school like you. Environmental law was just beginning, and I had a young professor called Barry Stewart, who later has gone on to a remarkable career, has been one of my lifelong colleagues. He started the first course in environmental law in Canada and created the Environmental Law Association of Canada and Pollution Probe, and he was a major force in Toronto and energizing that that whole area of work, both as a lawyer and a planner. He'd studied both in the London School of Economics and at the University of Michigan in addition. And the paper I wrote was on mercury and what the implications were in managing it, both in terms of the complexity of proving the damages and the liability case and the damages. The reason that I go there is that I would ultimately become a lawyer for the people impacted by mercury in the 80s. And it was a key feature of the shift in my career from environmental and indigenous advocacy into building processes for problems, not trying to force problems into processes. I come to realize that if I was really going to serve the interests of my client, I would have to learn how to negotiate these types of problems, because courts can stop stuff, declare stuff, take money, give you money, but they can't solve trapping problems for 10,000 people. They can't solve fishing problems. They just can't do that. And so the reality of the need to start thinking in much more creative ways about process, as opposed to simply having assumed that a legal framework or any framework could help, we had to build a framework for the process. So that is really where my world started to change fundamentally. But it had started a little bit before that. And that takes me to Jerry Cormack. The Environmental Mediation Institute, which was created by Jerry, and we learned of the work that was going on in northern Manitoba involving the hydro project, which was extremely complex. A whole election was fought on this, and I was in the middle of it. A government fell over. We had the instinct that there was a right man in the right place to come in to provide mediation services for us. We didn't know anything about mediation. We just had an instinct that somebody in the middle. Leon Mitchell would ultimately lead me to Jerry Cormack, and we ultimately worked together. So I go back to birds of a feather flock together. We were all kind of meeting, and now Homestake Mine is starting to converge the two of us together, as surprising as it may seem.
We had a real problem here in the state of Colorado, which is that we're a pioneer, as British Columbia was, in putting together environmental regulation of mining. Colorado was the first state in the U.S., I think, with a mine land reclamation law, but it was a weak law, and the board that managed mining here was, quite frankly, kind of old style industrial types who got their back up at any criticism. I appeared before them a couple of times, and they just started yelling at anybody who didn't agree with their worldview. Ultimately, the governor of Colorado got so much pressure because it was so evident to people that this regulatory agency was, basically an industry rubber stamp. He decided to try to create some more independence. He asked people who could they appoint to try to balance this agency. And my name came up, and he said, well, I want somebody who is reasonable and can talk to people. And the fact that we had just done this mediation was what clinched my appointment to that position. So I wound up getting appointed to our state mine land reclamation board, and moved from being a lawyer for environmental interests to being more of a government official in the middle of all these disputes.
And that's an important aspect of this whole kind of evolving context in which these issues have been dealt with. Administrative agencies like that, which is in effect what you wear, have much more capacity to adjust their process to fit the problem than a court does. A court imprisons the problem in its own set of rules, its own practice, its own value systems. But I think there's a much more greater room for flexibility. And I was appointed to the Manitoba Labor Board on a part-time basis in 1979, 1980. And that experience of working in an administrative tribunal gave me the further insights about how you can manage the interface between authority-driven processes and negotiation-based. They can reinforce each other because you can have more creativity around looking and encouraging the parties to find their own resolution as opposed to just coming in and imposing it on them. And that experience on the labor board is also part of what shaped my entry into the world of mediation, because it's seeing it as a process building. It's like a Lego set. And if lawyers are so used to having only one way to put the Lego pieces together, I was starting to think and learn that there's many, many ways that we can put the Lego pieces together to fit the problem. And that's really what you're talking about, I think, in essence, in Colorado.
Well, one of the things that happened is, as we felt our way forward, I wound up being elected chair of the agency, and I had been chair of the Mined Land Board for, I think, 4 days when the staff came to me and said, we have a problem. It's called the Summitville Mine. And the Summitville Mine is a very high altitude gold heap leach. It was the biggest gold heap leach that had ever been built in the United States. It was built by a bunch of irresponsible Canadian investors. And but basically what had happened was they raised a whole bunch of money on the stock market. An old friend of mine told me years ago, he said there are two kinds of mines. One mines minerals and the other mines stockholders.
Yeah.
And this was the kind that mined stockholders. And they took the money and left, and they left a big high altitude lake full of cyanide that was rising and threatening to overtop the embankment. And the pumps that kept it from overflowing were shut off because the electric company hadn't been paid, and they shut off the electrical current. So we tried really hard, but we were unable to prevent the embankment from being overtopped. The cyanide solution flowed all the way down and killed every fish in the entire length of the Alamosa River. And it turned out that this was just a horrendous mess. I think the government has spent $250, $300 million trying to clean it up, and it's still not done 30 years later. At this point, decided that we needed to take a look at how we were doing business, what our legal authority was, and because I had not been around, thank goodness, when this was permitted, I wasn't responsible for it. So I wound up being the head of the commission of inquiry that looked into this, and I used the multi-stakeholder approach that I had learned from Jerry Cormack and others to try to put together a multi-stakeholder panel to talk about what we needed to do. We ultimately came up with what was then Colorado's new mining law, which was a pretty dramatic improvement over what we've had. And we got a commitment from the legislature to fund the agency more adequately. So we made a major step forward in legal reform through a multi-stakeholder process. It was passed by the Colorado legislature without a dissenting vote in either house, which, when you look at how controversial mining issues are, that's a remarkable statement that everybody in the legislature supported this outcome.
When you're talking about that, it really strikes a chord with me in this way. The interconnection of how we both got to a certain place is deeply reflected in Jerry Cormack's story. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about it. So here's a Canadian, grew up in Vancouver, did his commerce degree. He ended up at the University of Michigan and did his PhD in the relationship in business, looking at the interface with community and race inside the workplace. And that ultimately took him into a deep involvement with Wayne State University, some of the major labor work they're doing, and ultimately to New York City in the late 60s, early 70s, where he started to build the dispute resolution programs in New York at the time. And that ultimately pulled him into St. Louis to work with a big sociologist there, I can't remember. He ended up working in the whole field of labor relations, came to be known, and the governor of Washington knew of this young professor that had come and asked him to mediate what would become the first mediation of an environmental nature on the Suquamish River. And that jump-started a energetic commitment, and he left his full-time faculty appointment to become a lecturer and created the Mediation Institute funded by Ford. And he had some very prominent people that came to be affiliated with him, including Clark Kerr, the president of UCLA, Ben Reed, assistant undersecretary of state, and Carter, and on it went. And he heard about the work of Leon Mitchell and invited him onto his board because Leon was now attracting the interest of people in Harvard, etc. And all these things were happening, as was this unfolding environmental legislation in the U.S. led by people like Ruckelshaus in Washington, who would work with Jerry. So all of these different elements of our careers kind of reflect not just the knowledge base that's coming out of any one kind of single stream. Our very careers and the people that we affiliate with show the building blocks of how these ideas were cross-pollinating and fertilizing in quite an interesting way when I think about it now and as we're having this conversation.
There were all of these things happening at once. One of them was, of course, the great wave of environmental legislation, the great wave of environmental concern. There were also the realization that we needed to be managing some of these big resource projects better, mining among them, but hardly alone. When we reformed the Colorado mining law, I started getting calls from other states saying, we're a little worried that we may need to improve what we're doing. We may need to up our game, may not be effective enough. So I started consulting with some other states about how to improve their legal framework for management of the industry, and was happily doing that when one day I got a call from somebody at the United Nations who said, we've received a request from the People's Republic of China. They're looking for an expert to help them reform their environmental laws for the Chinese coal mining industry. And would you be willing to do this? If I'd had the slightest idea what I was getting into, I would have probably said no, but it turned out to be an incredibly complicated, rich learning experience for me. I can only hope that the Chinese government got something out of the experience, but what it did was launch me onto an international career that ultimately took me out of the United States for many years, and starting with my work in China, but then moving on, I wound up going to Chile, where I started the environmental law program at the University of Chile Law School. It was the first environmental law teaching program in Chile, and working on mining and environment issues for the Chilean government. I lived in Chile for 3.5 years. So my perspective on these things was dramatically changed by seeing how they play out in developing countries. Of course,
Right.
Chile had suffered through the dictatorship, which just coming out of that, but Chile was a upper income country in South America. But as I got into this, I started learning more and more about countries that had very, very limited capacity for managing the industry and were suffering really a lot of conflict and impacts.
And I guess that's a theme that we'll come back to, I'm sure, repeatedly over our conversations ahead. The whole colonization and evolution of the relationships between minerals and development, and some of the social challenges that have arisen. And mining is always right in the middle of a lot of those kinds of challenges. But that's a big picture theme that I think we're going to be doing some exploring. But in a curious kind of way, in much of northern Canada, by the 50s and the 60s, it was not much different. These were remote areas with very traditional lifestyles, and they had still not evolved really into much more into the modern economy, simply because they ended up wherever the fur trade ended them up, which was somewhere across the Canadian North for many of these communities. Although that's not true nationally. The one thing you have to know about Canadian context is that Indigenous people are so diverse across the whole country that you can't speak of one approach or one place. But inevitably, as development started to burgeon, it came into direct interface with these communities in a very dramatic way, whether it's in Chile or in northern Manitoba. Hydro engineers, they had really no understanding of where Cross Lake, Manitoba was, or Norway House. Ironically, 200 years before, they were on the lips of every merchant in London because it was the source of a great empire, a trading empire. And Norway House at the tip of the north end of Lake Winnipeg was where a lot of money was being made. But by 1965 and 70, Hydro really wasn't that aware of that history at all, and they were finding it for the first time. And as startling as it may seem, when I first started to act for those communities, Hydro actually believed that they were operating that system within historic highs and lows. And so there was really no damages. It was of little consequence, it appeared to them, that when it used to be high, it was going to be low. And when it used to be low, it's going to be high. And people and animals don't adjust that quickly, nor does ice, nor does almost anything. But because of that, in the final agreement that was signed, they were prepared to enter into a comprehensive arbitration agreement that devolved very major power to an arbitrator, with powers that you can't even imagine in a conventional arbitration instrument, because they actually believed they were doing no damage. And it startles me in retrospect, but it just shows you how each of the professions that we build around these problems suction the world into the way they want to see it with their tools and values, and they just don't see outside of it. And you're in the vortex of where these forces are in collision. These big engineering organizations, whether they're mines or dam builders or mill builders, that is the essential nature of the conflict that we often find ourselves in the middle.
You put your thumb on something here that's really important. I found that same thing too, as I started visiting mine sites and talking to mining people around the world. They were largely convinced that what they were doing was actually benefiting the societies they were operating in. These communities were better off for having them there. People were learning from them. They were getting electricity and roads, and so they were doing better as a result of the presence of mining. One of the things that really struck me is that this is an industry that is largely built on research, right? That a lot of the development in human science and engineering and economies, that people finding ways to extract minerals better, produce them better, use them for more things, and it's all based on rigorous research. And the problem is that when it came to the social side, the same people who insisted on very high standard of rigorous research on the physical engineering side had no idea how to do any kind of rigorous investigation of what was happening. So even today, it is still rare for people to be doing rigorous research on what are the actual impacts on these communities? What is happening here? What are the economic benefits? What are the economic drawbacks? What's really going on here? And that's, I think, one of the things we really need to keep focusing on is the importance of research, rigorous research to really understand what's happening.
I've been thinking about that a lot in the context of this emerging ESG debate that I'm sure we'll have before the end of these conversations. It was really an attempt to turn sustainability into metrics that would meet the needs of the financial sector. And what gets counted counts. And increasingly, we're getting kind of blowback in a variety of ways. Some of it's this highly politicized environment, but there is genuine concern that is now becoming manifest that some things aren't quantifiable. How do you put a number on a corporate culture? How do you put a number on a crack internally that isn't been detected and is leading to unforeseen consequences internally in terms of external relationships? How do you put numbers on that? So it's also a sense of humility that you have to rely on the eyes of the beholder. We have to understand where people are coming, because value means many different things. Value means something different to a peasant farmer who sees a mine being built in relatively water restricted areas, and when somebody comes blasting into town yelling the word game changer, they sure bloody damn right it's a game changer. There won't be any water for me to continue operating, and I'm a 55-year-old peasant farmer and I'm out of business. It's a game changer, all right. But we make all these assumptions about how the other side's going to see it. And that's really the vortex where we have been building our careers. How do you manage that?
That was the next step in my career, right? I went to work for a large Canadian funded research institution, the International Development Research Center, a nonprofit organization sponsored by the Canadian government. And my job was to do research in the 23 countries of Latin America and the Caribbean on the impacts of mining. And one of the things we started finding out was other things like the window test. You have somebody who has a mining project that's worth hundreds of millions of dollars, where an unhappy community has the ability to shut the thing down, where in all too many cases it's led to violence. And what you wind up with is engineers who really should know better saying, we can tell that the people there are supporting us, because at the last project, when we drove through the village, we had to roll the windows up because they were throwing garbage at us as we went by. And now we can drive through the village with our windows open. Mm-hmm. And that's our metric for whether people are happy or not. We just started learning all kinds of things about the impact of mining on health, the impact of mining on the local economy, right? One of the almost universal things is rapid escalation in prices of staple commodities. Suddenly the rice or the potatoes or the wheat or whatever people are eating, the price has doubled, tripled. for the people who are getting a paycheck from the mine, that may not be as much of a problem, but for, let's say, the elderly or people who don't have a job in the mine, suddenly they're unable to afford housing, they're unable to afford food, and it creates a conflict within the community between the people who succeeded in catching the brass ring and the people who didn't.
One of the things that one increasingly comes to understand is that to understand anything, you have to understand all of the moving pieces around the dynamic, that nothing is in isolation. On Lake Winnipeg, the forces of change were driven by the fact that 6 buyers in Chicago and New York controlled our price structure. And ultimately, it led to the breakdown of the industry and the development of a new alternative. In the mining sector, we understand these supply chains that are so critical, and we're going to no doubt have lots of conversation that are building, as they say now, critical minerals has become the operative word of the day. There's so many benefits, but the challenges that we're going to have to talk through as we see the evolution of this is how we manage the face of change to build positive outcomes and minimizing the negative outcomes. That's really where the mining industry, I believe, today is struggling to find a way. It has come from some deeply turbulent times, and there's still a lot of bad news stories. But there's no doubt that the industry is trying to drive to new places, and with mixed success. But the changes that we're going to be able to see, and part of our role, as I see it in these conversations, is to kind of hone down on some of those stepping stones that we see as critical.
Part of the issue that we need to focus on is that in the time period we're talking about, there was a really fundamental change. For centuries, most of Africa, large parts of Asia, parts of Latin America were embedded in colonial regimes run by European powers. And the way that worked was, in the mining context, was pretty simple. The mining got done in developing countries. We didn't look too carefully at what the impacts were. The real money was in the processing of the ore, which was all done in Europe. And ultimately, we wound up with a very unequal and unfair system. That system, after centuries of being in place, broke down during the period of time we're talking about.
Right.
Suddenly, all of the French-speaking countries in Africa, the Portuguese-speaking countries, the English-speaking countries, all wound up shedding their colonial roots and trying to charge off into independence. And the question of what does that mean if you're now running a newly independent country that has relatively small number of skilled people, that has very limited resources, that has in many cases active hostility from your former colonial masters? What's the policy that you follow if you are trying to make sure that these mineral resources are used for the benefit of very poor people in very poor countries? What are the policies you follow to try to make that happen?
One of my big concerns, and I hope it's a theme that we can look at here, is the whole notion that if policies aren't informed, and my favorite expression is drilling up, from real circumstances, real people, real places where they're struggling to find a way to interact and build an accommodation with each other, to live with each other in spite of their differences. Unless those policies are built in that way, the policies can often become a framework for frustration, because as they download them, they don't meet the needs of that community. They try to cookie cutter them into their own way of thinking. We have to build our way up. And if you can't envision how a policy is going to download in a practical way, then the policy can be not helpful, but unhelpful. It can create tension. So the whole area of how we evolve governance structures that are more responsive, because it's the playground of the academics and the policy shops and the policy wonk to spin out endless policies. But fundamentally, at ground zero, it's different people with different interests, different plays, different rights, different values that are trying to find a way to live with each other in spite of their differences. That's the marketplace in which change has to be managed, in my view. And it's so easy to get seduced into some grand policy formulation. So that's a theme I hope we can build on a bit.
One of the things that happened in the period we're talking about is that we wound up with developing country governments whose big goal was to generate some revenue to pay for something, right? Schools, health, roads, all of the things that they needed. And they, in many cases, saw mineral resources as being the only path forward. At the same time, we had a world environmental movement that in many cases thought that mining was just wicked and a source of terrible problems. And mining earned that. Mining really earned that attitude. But we wound up with a lot of conflicts between the governments of developing countries and environmental interests.
And communities, because the national interest was overweighing the interest of a community. So a whole question of distribution of wealth, distribution of benefit is a huge other topic area I'm hoping we can look at.
Yeah, in many cases, this was part of the legacy of colonialism, that you have 4 or 5 different ethnic groups, one of which winds up running the government of the newly independent country. But what happens if the mine is in the territory of one of the other ethnic groups? Then do we just simply have a struggle for every penny that goes to the local community is a penny that doesn't go to the national government? It's a zero-sum game. And so we have a struggle between local interests and the national government interests over where the revenue goes and who has control.
And even in Canada, where there's overlapping territorial interest in certain properties, the question is, how do you share the benefits or allocate the disbenefits, I guess, to put a clumsy way of saying it, between competing territorial interests? I mean, it's a generic problem. So when you think about all of these areas that we've kind of touched down on here in this initial conversation, Luke, it seems to me that that if you're sitting in a mine and you're a mine engineer and you're building a mine or you're exploring for a mine, you didn't know you were signing up for having to come into the kind of context that you and I have just been describing. They're going to into a world in which they are going to be confronting these range of problems that are not amenable to linear lines or straight line thinking, that they're buying into this whole other world, I think has been a pretty big professional judgment. It's no different in a way than a judge who suddenly told you're going to have to try to figure out ways to also resolve these through mediation and negotiation. I didn't sign up for that. I didn't sign up. So there's a lot of professional baggage that also has to be part of these conversations, because that can be part of the issues we need to struggle with.
I have one other point I want to make as we wind down, right? Which is the governments of the home countries that these mining companies are based in, the UK, Canada, Australia, had a very, very limited ability to manage what they were doing in the remote forests of Papua New Guinea or Mozambique or Democratic Republic of Congo. So there's no home country government control that really amounted to much. at the same time, the governments of these developing countries didn't have the ability to manage these complex industries, particularly in a world full of corruption. So what we wound up with was an industry that's operating largely without government. Government does have a role. Government does set certain kinds of rules, and in the absence of rules from home countries, the absence of rules from the countries where the mining is occurring, we wound up with this big explosion of attempts to create international rules through the performance standards of the International Finance Corporation, the Equator Principles, the voluntary principles on security and human rights, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, the International Code for the Management of Cyanide. So that's just the beginning, but there's an entire superstructure that attempts to create some kind of rules of the road where there's some kind of system that people are trying to fit within and operate within. And that's another subject that needs to be dealt with.
My final comment here is just harkening back to the period in the 60s, in the 80s when Jerry Cormick and I were teaching at the Banff Center, and I'll talk about that more in later conversation. But for about 12 years, we were teaching courses with 25 people in them that represented diverse different constituencies on 3 and 5 day courses. And I would later also teach in the MBA customized program. And the story I want to end with is a really short and sweet story. So we'd finished the end of the week of this MBA that are dealing with all of these kinds of issues to give them a greater sense of comfort and competency in dealing with the kind of world in which they were having to operate. And this, we were going around the room to get the nuggets that they were going to take away from the week with me. And this big, husky, strong mine manager stood up, mining engineer, and lovely guy, very, very fine man. He said, "You know, Sigurdson, I've learned one thing here. I've learned I'm a human being first and engineer second." I said, "Well, if spending a week here gave you that insight, I don't think you really needed to. You just needed to remember that you're a farm boy from Saskatchewan. And if you just stick to that, you'll be in real good shape, my friend." Anyway, it was a simple but profound statement. He suddenly he realized he knew a hell of a lot more than he thought he did.
Well, I guess the final note here really is, after immense amounts of effort to try to create these international systems of rules for people to operate within, the ICMM and the ICMM principles and the Canadian towards sustainable mining. After all of that, one of the things we find is that those rules are largely written by and for the North Atlantic Club, right? The Anglo-Saxon mining countries. And now we see that there's an explosion of investment abroad by countries or by companies from China, India, Brazil, who feel like they weren't invited to write these rules, and that the rules, in fact, in some cases are designed to impede them and disadvantage them in competition. So there's quite a story to be told here, and I look forward, Glenn, after all of these years of working together, I really look forward to having some further and future conversations about all of these subjects.
And I do as well. And as we grow this conversation, Priscilla and Mónica are going to continue to fertilize our directions and our thinking. And it's exciting to begin the process, Priscilla. Mónica, thank you so much.
And I thank you both, Glenn and Luke. Wonderful conversation, and we will have more for everyone in the future. Stay tuned. What an incredible way to kick off our series. Glenn and Luke have given us a deep and personal look at the mining industry's evolution from its roots in resource-based communities to the broader environmental and social challenges it faces today.
Absolutely, Priscilla. I was especially struck by how both Glenn and Luke emphasize the importance of mediation, inclusive dialogue, and conflict resolution skills in finding ways to build bridges between opposing interests. Whether it is managing large-scale projects or engaging with local communities, their insights show that open dialogue and thoughtful negotiation are key to creating lasting, positive outcomes in the mining world. The podcast also highlighted the ongoing challenge of balancing environmental sustainability with the socioeconomic benefits of mining, especially in the context of the energy transition and critical mineral demands.
So thank you, Glenn Sigurdson and Luke Danielson, for joining us, and thank you to our listeners for tuning into this first episode. We hope today's conversation has sparked your curiosity about the complex world of mining and resource management, and we encourage you to reflect on how we can collectively shape the future of mining through responsible practices that create a solid foundation for global supply chains. We invite you to share your views and comments at any time, and we would love to hear from you and learn from your perspectives.
In our next episode, we will take a broader look at the global mining industry and the role of international regulations. How do countries with limited resources create robust frameworks for managing mining? And what happens when those frameworks are missing? Join us as we dive into the rise of global standards with stories from Chile to China and explore the challenges of implementing meaningful environmental and social safeguards. Until then, stay engaged and keep asking the important questions.